I hope everyone's doing well this morning. Grab your coffee, grab your tea, grab your Bible, settle in, because this morning is going to be a little bit different. You know, Father's Day has already come and gone by the time you're seeing this. The World Cup is underway. Nations are gathering, people are cheering, families are watching together, entire countries are rallying behind teams. And all week long, I thought we were going to make an episode about the World Cup. I thought I was going to make an episode about the gathering of nations, technology, infrastructure, symbolism, about all the things happening behind the stadium walls. And don't worry, we're still going to talk about all that. But something happened this week. Actually, a lot of things happened this week. And somewhere along the way, this stopped being a World Cup episode. This became a reflection, a Watchman reflection, a father's reflection, a reflection about generations, a reflection about legacy, a reflection about what kind of world we are building and what kind of world we are leaving behind. Now, before we get into any of that, let me just be honest with you. Father's Day felt a little strange this year. Not bad, just strange. I called my father and wished him a happy Father's Day. And after I got off the phone, I found myself sitting there and thinking about him, thinking about my grandfather, thinking about my daughters, thinking about the choices we make in life, thinking about the mistakes we make, thinking about the opportunities we miss, the opportunities we take, and I realized something. The older I get, the less interested I am in judging the generations that came before me, and the more interested I am in understanding them. You know, when you're young, it's easy to look at your parents and think, I would have done that differently. I would have made a better choice. I would have seen that coming. But the older you get, you become responsible for other people. You carry burdens nobody sees. You make decisions with incomplete information. You make mistakes. You learn lessons the hard way. And suddenly you realize something. Most people are not trying to fail. Most people are not trying to make bad decisions. Most people are simply doing the best they can with the information they have at the time. That realization changes how you see the world. And it changes how you see your parents, your grandparents, and eventually yourself. Because one day our children will look back at us and they will see our mistakes too. Not because we're bad people, but because we're people. And that's been on my mind a lot lately. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. I've mentioned before that I tend to go through these little seasons, these dips, these little periods where I get more reflective and thoughtful, more introspective, and I start asking questions. I start evaluating things. I start looking inward. And for the last several days, I've been doing a lot of that. Not because something terrible happened, and not because the sky is falling, just because life has a way of showing you down sometimes and forcing you to think. And if I'm being completely honest, brothers and sisters, every conversation I've had lately has felt heavier. Not in a bad way, but in a meaningful way. I found myself thinking about family more, thinking about time more, legacy, thinking about what actually matters more. And then something happened that I didn't expect. The fellowship showed up. Now, I need you to hear me on this. I spent so much time worrying about growing a channel that I almost missed the fact that God was building a fellowship. Let me say that again. I spent so much time worrying about growing a channel that I almost missed the fact that God was building this fellowship. And that realization hit me hard this week because I started reading comments and more comments and more comments. And the overwhelming message wasn't work harder, it wasn't upload faster, it wasn't why aren't you producing more content. The overwhelming message was we are not leaving. And brothers and sisters, that means something to me because this is not a normal YouTube behavior. People were saying, slow down if you need to, rest if you need to, take care of yourself, we'll still be here. This is a fellowship. And tonight, I want to honor some of the people helping build that fellowship. First and foremost, our founding member, Ann Rapture Ready. Thank you for continuing to ask thoughtful questions. Thank you for caring about biblical accuracy. Thank you for helping keep these discussions grounded. And we've got KK, sister. If there's been an unofficial encourager of this fellowship, it's you, KK. Always encouraging, always paying attention, always praying, always reminding people they're not alone. And KK, if you're listening tonight, I appreciate you. Then Rivercat speaks. He's consistently encouraging me, consistently supporting, helping keep morale up, helping pull the sheep back into the fold. We have Tom Troy 66, scripture-based. He has wisdom, brings perspective. He brings reminders that even wisdom itself sometimes comes with sorrow. We have Red Stamp 4185, Karen Davidson 1182, Rachel Caldell, all the way from Wells. She's also looking for fellowship. We have Craig Hines 9867, Shell G, Susan Alexander, Love One Another Always, and everyone else who has always been praying quietly behind the scenes. Tonight's top supporters are KK, Rivercat Speaks, Car Tom Troy 66, Red Stamp, Karen Davidson, and tonight's sponsor is every single person who has prayed for me. Not donated, not subscribed, but prayed, because prayer matters. Prayer changes things. Prayer strengthens people. Prayer reminds us we're not carrying burdens alone. And brothers and sisters, that leads me to something we always say around here. Jesus is our main sponsor. People help keep the Watchtower lit, and we're grateful for them. But Christ is the foundation. Christ is the reason we're here. Christ is the reason we keep showing up. Christ is the reason we keep studying, we keep watching, we keep hoping. And tonight, before we go any further, I want us to remember that, because the rest of this episode is going to ask a question. One question over and over again. A question that the World Cup made me think about. A question that Father's Day made me think about. A question that the fellowship made me think about. A question my daughters made me think about, my father, my grandparents. And a question that every watchman eventually has to ask. What kind of world are we building? And what kind of world are we leaving behind? The more I thought about Father's Day, the more I thought about the fellowship. The more I thought about my daughters, the more I thought about the World Cup. The more I realized all these things are connected by a single question. Why do people gather? Let's think about it. Why do humans gather? Not just now, not just for sports, for concerts, or churches, but throughout all of history. Why? Because if we're honest, human beings have always been gathering around something. Ancient tribes gathered around fires. Ancient villages gathered around storytellers. Ancient kingdoms gathered around festivals. Ancient Israel gathered around feasts. People gathered around kings. People gathered around temples. People gathered around markets, around celebrations. And today, people gather around sports, politics, entertainment, social media, churches, movements, ideas. Technology changes. The location changes. The symbols change. But the behavior remains remarkably consistent. Human beings gather. The question is not whether gathering is good or bad. The question is, what are we gathering around? Because God himself created us to gather. Let's think about that. One of the very first things God said was, "It is not good that the man should be alone." Human beings were never designed to exist in complete isolation. We were created for relationships, community, for fellowship. Maybe that's one reason why so many people are struggling right now. Because we live in the most connected age in human history, and somehow many people feel more isolated than we ever have before. We have smartphones, internet, social media, we have instant communication, and yet people starving for connection, starving for belonging, for fellowship, which brings me back to Rachel Caldell from Wells. One of the things that stood out to me in the fellowship was how many people are looking for genuine fellowship. Not entertainment or content or information, but fellowship, community, and connection. People want somewhere they belong. And if we're honest, brothers and sisters, I think that's part of what drives events like the World Cup. Now remember, this is not a sports channel. I don't spend a lot of time watching sports. As a matter of fact, most of you know I'm the exact opposite of that. I spend all of my free time studying, reading, researching, thinking, asking questions, trying to understand reality, trying to understand people, trying to understand God, trying to understand why we do the things that we do. But that's exactly why the World Cup became interesting to me. Not because of who wins, not because of the score or the trophy, but because of what it reveals about human beings. Think about what happens during the World Cup. People spend years preparing. They save money, they buy tickets, they travel across oceans, They wear specific colors, they carry specific flags, they sing specific songs. They gather with complete strangers, and somehow those strangers immediately become family. Why? Because for a moment they all share a common identity. Now hold on to that thought, because we're going to come back to the identity later. But first, I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about pilgrimage, because the more I thought about the World Cup, the more it reminded me about something ancient: pilgrimages. Now, when most people hear the word pilgrimage, they think about religion. People traveling to Jerusalem, people traveling to sacred places, people making long journeys to holy sites. And yes, that's true. But if you step back for a moment, you'll notice something fascinating. Human beings have always made pilgrimages, sometimes religious, sometimes cultural, sometimes political or social. People travel incredible distances to be part of something bigger than themselves. And the question is why? Why would someone spend thousands of dollars to travel halfway around the world? Why would someone stand in line for hours? Why would someone sleep in airports? Why would someone sit in traffic for 10 hours? Why? Because they're seeking something. And I don't think it's really soccer. I don't think it's really the stadium. I don't think it's the event itself, but I think they're seeking meaning. They're seeking connection, identity, and belonging. I think people are seeking memories. And if we're being really honest, I think many people are seeking transcendence. They're looking for something bigger than the ordinary daily routine, something that makes them feel alive, something that makes them feel connected, something that reminds them that they are part of a larger story. Now, here's where things get interesting, because when I was younger, I don't think I understood that. When I was younger, I thought people were just chasing excitement, success, entertainment, pleasure. But the older I get, the more I realize something. Most people aren't really chasing pleasure. They're chasing meaning. The problem is that sometimes they don't know where to find it. And that's one of the reasons I think our culture feels so lost. Because people know they need meaning, they know they need purpose, they know they need connection, but they keep looking for it in places they can't fully satisfy. A trophy can't do it, money can't do it, fame can't do it, popularity can't do it, success can't do it, because eventually the game ends. Eventually the crowd goes home, the lights go out, the trophy gathers dust, and the realization brings us to something else that I've been thinking about lately, and that's aging. Now, don't worry, I'm not about to spend 30 minutes complaining about getting older, but I will tell you something that I've noticed. The older I get, the more my questions change. When I was younger, I asked, what do I want? Where do I want to go? What can I achieve? How much can I accomplish? Now my questions are different. Now I ask, what matters? What lasts? What am I leaving behind? What am I teaching? What example am I setting? What kind of world will my daughters inherit? Because brothers and sisters, that's a completely different set of questions. Maybe that's part of becoming a father. Maybe that's part of getting older. Maybe that's part of wisdom. Because wisdom has a way of shifting your focus from yourself to the generations that come after you. You start realizing something. One day, somebody else is going to inherit the consequences of what we build. The systems, the culture, the habits, the values, the technologies, the institutions, traditions, the faith, or the lack of faith. Somebody is going to inherit all of it. And that's where I think Father's Day, the World Cup, and the fellowship all intersect. Because all three are ultimately about inheritance. The World Cup is passed from generation to generation. Families are passed from generation to generation. Wisdom is passed from generation to generation. Faith is passed from generation to generation. And one day, every one of us will hand something to the people coming behind us. The question is, what exactly are we handing them? That brings us to another topic, one that civilizations have wrestled with for thousands of years: the power of spectacle. That's where we're going next, because if humanity has always gathered, then we need to ask why civilizations have always built spectacles for people to gather around. So let's keep pulling on this thread, because if humanity has always gathered, then civilizations have always built things for humanity to gather around. So let's think about that for a moment. Every civilization, every kingdom, every empire, every culture At some point, they create spectacles, festivals, games, celebrations, parades, ceremonies, competitions, public events. But why? Because human beings are drawn towards shared experiences. Now, this is where many people immediately jump to extremes. One group says it's all meaningless. Another group says it's all manipulation. And I don't think either answer is complete. I think reality is usually more complicated than that, because sometimes a celebration is just a celebration. Sometimes a community gathering is simply a community gathering. Sometimes people genuinely enjoy being together. Sometimes families genuinely enjoy sharing experiences. And there's nothing wrong with that. But as watchmen, we also have to recognize something. Attention is powerful, very powerful. Throughout history, those who understand attention understand influence. Not necessarily control, but influence. So let's think about it. If you can direct the attention of millions of people towards something, you've accomplished something remarkable. So let's make this personal. Every parent already understands this, because if you've ever tried to get a child's attention, you know how valuable it is. Children naturally focus on whatever captures their imagination. And adults aren't all that different. We're just more sophisticated about it. The things we focus on eventually shape us. The things we repeatedly pay attention to eventually influence us. The things we constantly consume eventually affect how we think. And that's why attention matters. Now, when people hear the phrase "bred in circuses," they often think of ancient Rome. The idea was simple: provide food, provide entertainment, keep people occupied. But here's the interesting thing: most discussions about bread and circuses stop there. They never ask the deeper question: why were people so eager to participate in the first place? Because the answer isn't simply manipulation. The answer is that people wanted something. They wanted community. They wanted excitement. They wanted relief from hardship. They wanted shared experiences, and they wanted meaning. And honestly, brothers and sisters, I think that's still true today. People are exhausted. They're stressed. They're worried. They're isolated. They're overwhelmed. And so when something comes along that gives them a sense of connection, they naturally gravitate toward it. It's not necessarily weakness, that's humanity. Now, here's where things get interesting. Because if you think about it, the modern world runs on attention. Social media runs on attention, news runs on attention, politics, advertising, entertainment. Everything is competing for your attention. And sometimes I wonder if attention has become one of the most valuable currencies on earth. Let's think about it. Companies spend billions trying to capture attention. Governments spend enormous resources trying to capture attention. Influencers spend their lives trying to capture attention. Everybody wants attention, because attention eventually becomes influence, and influence eventually shapes behavior. So let me ask you a question. What are you paying attention to every day? Let's think about it honestly. What do you say is important? And what actually receives your attention? Because those two things are not always the same thing. I can say my family is important, but where does my time go? I can say God is important, but where does my intention go? I can say truth is important, but what am I actually feeding my mind every day? Those are uncomfortable questions, but they're important questions. One of the reasons I've been reflecting so much lately is because I've been asking myself those questions. I told you earlier that I've been thinking about my parents and my grandparents. One thing I realized is that every generation has blind spots. Every generation thinks that we see clearly. Every generation thinks they understand reality. Every generation thinks they're getting it right. And then time passes, and suddenly they see things that they didn't see before. And that's wisdom. But wisdom has a strange price tag. Wisdom often arrives carrying regret. Not always, but often. Because wisdom frequently comes from mistakes, from failures, missed opportunities, lessons learned the hard way. And that realization has changed how I look at people. It has changed how I look at my parents. It has changed how I look at myself. Because now I realize something. The people who come before us weren't stupid, and they weren't blind. and they weren't trying to ruin things. They were simply operating with the information that they had, the experiences they had, the wounds they had, the understanding they had, just like we are. And one day, our children will probably look back at us and think, how did they not see that? Just like we look at the previous generations, and honestly, they'll probably be right. There are things we are missing right now, things that future generations will see clearly. And the question is whether we're humble enough to admit it. So let's bring this back to the World Cup. Because one thing the World Cup reveals is that human beings still crave shared attention. For a brief moment, billions of people focus on the same event. So let's think about how rare that is. Billions. Different languages, different cultures, different countries, religions, different political views, different backgrounds. And for a moment, attention converges. Now, as a watchman, I find that fascinating. Not because of the game, because of what it reveals about humanity. Human beings are capable of focusing enormous amounts of energy on shared experiences. The question becomes, what happens when that energy is directed towards truth? What happens when that energy is directed towards faith? What happens when that energy is directed towards service? What happens when that energy is directed towards family? What happens when that energy is directed towards Christ? Because that is the most interesting question. Before we move on, I want to say something to the fathers listening, because this hit me pretty hard this week. You know, Father's Day came and went. Maybe some of you had amazing Father's Days. Maybe some of you spent your time with your kids. Maybe some of you got phone calls. Maybe some of you got visits. Maybe some of you felt appreciated, and that's wonderful. But I also know there are fathers listening who had different experiences. Maybe your relationship with your children is complicated. Maybe your relationship with your father is complicated. Maybe your Father's Day brings up more questions than celebrations. Maybe it brings up regrets. Maybe it brings up old wounds. Maybe it reminds you of opportunities you wish you had back. And brothers, if that's you, I want you to hear something. The story is not over. As long as you're breathing, the story is not over. You can still learn. You can still grow. You can still apologize. You can still forgive. You can still become a better father. You can still become a better son. You can still become a better man. And that's one reason I remain hopeful. Because people can change. I've changed. You've changed. We're all changing. And if people can change, then families can heal. And if families can heal, then communities can heal. And if communities can heal, then nations can heal. Now, that might sound overly optimistic to some people, but I don't think it is. Because hope is not pretending problems don't exist. Hope is believing problems are not the final word. And that brings us to something even deeper. Because once we start talking about nations, we inevitably end up talking about identity. Who are we? Where do we belong? Why do people become so attached to flags, teams, tribes, and groups? And brothers and sisters, that's where things start getting really interesting. Because beneath every flag, beneath every team, beneath every nation is a human being asking the same question. Who am I? And where do I belong? So let's talk about identity. Because I honestly think this is one of the biggest battles taking place in the world right now. Not politics or economics or technology, but identity. Because beneath almost every major conflict, every movement, every tribe, every ideology, every community, there is a human being trying to answer two questions. Who am I and where do I belong? Now, that might seem overly simplistic, but think about it. Why do people join groups? Why do people wear uniforms? Why do people wave flags? Why do people defend teams? Why do people gather into tribes? Because human beings crave identity. We want to know who we are. And we want to know where we fit. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. As a matter of fact, it's completely natural. God created human beings with a desire for belonging. The problem begins when temporary identities become ultimate identities. So let me explain. There's nothing wrong with loving your country. There's nothing wrong with supporting a team. There's nothing wrong with being proud of your heritage. There's nothing wrong with enjoying community. But the trouble starts when those things become the foundation of who we are, because every earthly identity is temporary. Every single one. The team changes, the nations change, the culture changes, the trends change, the generations change, everything changes. That's something I've been thinking a lot about lately, maybe even more than usual, because the older I get, the more I realize how quickly things change. When you're young, life feels permanent. The world feels permanent. Your circumstances feel permanent, your struggles, your victories. Then you wake up one day and realize almost everything has changed. The music changes, culture changes, technology changes, people around you change, the mirror changes, your priorities change. And if we're not careful, that realization can become frightening, but it can also become freeing. Because once you understand that everything temporary changes, you begin searching for something eternal, something stable, something that remains. And I think that's part of why people eventually find themselves searching for God. Because sooner or later, every earthly identity disappoints us. Not because it's evil, because it's temporary. Now, let's bring this back to the World Cup. Think about what happens during the tournament. People, instantly from tribes, somebody puts on a jersey, waves a flag, learns a few chants, and suddenly they're part of something. They belong. And honestly, there's something beautiful about that. Human beings finding connection, human beings sharing experiences, human beings celebrating together. But it also reveals something deeper. The human heart is constantly searching for a tribe. The human heart is constantly searching for a family. The human heart is constantly searching for belonging. And if we don't intentionally direct that search toward truth, something else will gladly step in and provide a substitute. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Because once you start talking about tribes, eventually you start talking about nations. And once you start talking about nations, eventually you'll find yourself standing at Babel. Now, I know some of you already know where I'm going, but stay with me. Because this is one of the most misunderstood stories in the Bible. Most people remember Babel as a story where God confused the languages. And yes, that happened. But that's not the deepest lesson. The deeper lesson is about unity. Humanity was united. One language, one purpose, one project, one vision, one direction. And on the surface, that sounds wonderful. Unity, togetherness, cooperation. Those all sound like positive things. And often they are. But Scripture reveals something important. Not all unity is created equal. Because the question isn't simply, are people united? The question is, united around what? At Babel, humanity was united around human ambition, human achievement, human glory, human power. The focus wasn't God. The focus was humanity. The focus was making a name for themselves. And that changes everything, because unity without truth eventually becomes dangerous. Unity without humility eventually becomes dangerous. Unity without God eventually becomes dangerous. Now, contrast that with Pentecost. This is where things get beautiful. At Pentecost, we see something fascinating. Many nations, many languages, many cultures, many backgrounds, and yet God brings understanding. Not by erasing differences, but by working through them. That's important, because God didn't create uniformity. He created unity. Those are not the same thing. Uniformity says everybody must become identical. Unity says people can remain distinct while sharing a common foundation. Brothers and sisters, that distinction matters, especially today, because we're living in a world obsessed with both identity and unity. Everybody wants identity, everybody wants belonging, everybody wants connection and community, but very few people stop and ask, what foundation are we building that identity upon? So let me ask the fellowship something. When your children look for identity, where are they finding it? Think about that. Social media, politics, entertainment, sports, popularity, peer groups, algorithms, internet communities. Because whether we realize it or not, something is disciplining the next generation. Something is teaching them who they are. Something is teaching them what matters. Something is teaching them how to see themselves. And that's why fathers matter. That's why mothers matter. That's why grandparents matter. That's why churches matter. Because if we don't help shape identity, something else will. And here's something else I've been thinking about. The older I get, the more I realize that children aren't really listening to what we say. They're watching what we do. So let's think about that. How much of who you are today come from lessons you were explicitly taught? And how much came from things you simply observed? The way your parents handled stress, the way they treated people, the way they talked, the way they worked, the way they loved, the way they failed, the way they recovered. Children are always watching. And honestly, that's both terrifying and hopeful. It's terrifying because it means our example matters. It's hopeful because it means small actions matter. The way we respond to disappointment matters. The way we respond to conflict matters. The way we respond to mistakes matters. The way we respond to Father's Day not going exactly how we hoped matters. The way we respond to discouragement matters. People are watching. Children are watching. The next generation is watching. And that realization has changed how I view success. You know, when I was younger, success meant accomplishment, achievement, recognition, goals. Now success looks different. Now success looks more like faithfulness. Showing up, learning, growing, repenting, trying again, continuing to build, continuing to love, continuing to seek truth, continuing to follow Christ. Because eventually every earthly accomplishment fades, but faithfulness leaves legacy. So hold on to that thought, because we're about to shift into something the World Cup reveals better than almost anything else. Systems, infrastructure, technology, things nobody notices until they stop working. Brothers and sisters, that's where the conversation starts getting very practical, because a good watchman learns to notice the systems behind the spectacle. So let's step behind the stadium walls, because this is where the watchman starts seeing something that most people never notice. The average person sees the game. The watchman sees the systems. The average person sees the crowd, but the watchman sees the infrastructure. The average person sees the trophy, but the watchman sees everything required to make the trophy presentable. And once you start looking at the world, well, in that particular manner, you can never really unsee it again. Think about the World Cup for a moment. Millions of people traveling, millions of people eating, millions of people communicating, millions of people moving from place to place, stadiums operating, transportation systems operating, power grids operating, water systems operating, cell towers, internet networks, emergency services, medical teams, security systems, food distribution, broadcasting networks, thousands upon thousands of people doing jobs that most viewers will never even think about. And that's fascinating to me because it reveals something that applies to far more than just sports. It reveals how dependent modern civilization has become on systems. Now, before anybody misunderstands me, that's not automatically a bad thing. Human civilization has always depended on systems. Roads are systems, architecture is a system, markets are systems, families are systems, churches are systems. The question isn't whether systems exist. The question is whether we understand the systems that we are building. Because one thing that I've learned through life is that people rarely appreciate systems when they're working. They only notice them when they fail. Nobody praises electricity every day, but let the power go out for 24 hours. Suddenly, everybody remembers how important it is. Nobody praises clean water every day, but let the water stop flowing. Suddenly, everybody pays attention. Nobody praises supply chains every day until the shelves are empty, and then everybody notices. And honestly, fatherhood has taught me a lot about that. Because a good father spends much of his life managing systems that nobody ever talks about. The bills get paid, the food appears, the transportation works, the lights stay on, the roof stays overhead, the Problems get solved, and often nobody notices. Not because they're ungrateful, because that's how systems work. When they're functioning properly, they become invisible. And brothers and sisters, I think that's one reason I've gained so much respect for previous generations as I've gotten older. When I was younger, I mostly noticed what wasn't working. Now I spend more time appreciating what was working. Let's think about that. Every generation inherits systems. Roads they didn't build, buildings they didn't construct, institutions they didn't create, knowledge that they didn't discover. And often we take those things for granted until they begin breaking down. Then suddenly we realize how much effort went into maintaining them. So let's take this one step further, because behind every system is something even more important, and that's people. People built the roads. People maintain the power grid. People operate the hospitals. People transport the food. People repair the infrastructure. People solve problems. And that's one thing modern technology sometimes causes us to forget. Technology is impressive, but technology is ultimately created, maintained, and directed by people. Which brings us into another question. What role is technology playing in the world our children are inheriting? So, brothers and sisters, you've heard me talk about technology before, and I always try to stay balanced, because technology is neither an angel nor a demon. It's a tool. A hammer can build a house, a hammer can break a window. The tool itself isn't making moral decisions, the people are. The same is true of technology. The internet can spread truth, and the internet can spread lies. Artificial intelligence can assist learning, or it can spread confusion. Social media can connect people, but it often isolates people. The technology isn't the whole story. The people using it are part of the story. That doesn't mean we ignore the tools. As watchmen, we should pay attention, not because we're afraid, but because we're responsible. So let me ask you something. How many of you remember life before smartphones? Take a second and think about it. How different was daily life? How different were conversations? How different was attention, boredom, waiting? I remember being bored as a kid. That sounds strange today, but boredom used to exist. You stood in line and waited. You sat on the porch and thought. You stared at clouds and made little animal shapes. You wandered through the woods. You daydreamed. Now, every spare second is filled. You scroll, you swipe, click, watch, repeat. I don't think we fully understood what that change means yet. Future generations probably will. Just like we look back at previous generations and notice the things that they couldn't see. One day people will look back at us and say, how did they not realize what that was doing to their attention? Maybe they'll be right, maybe they won't. But it's worth asking the question, because attention shapes identity, and identity shapes destiny. So here's something interesting. The World Cup could not exist in its current form without technology. So let's think about it. The tickets are digital, global broadcasts, satellite communications, instant translation, social media, streaming platforms, data systems, security networks. The event itself becomes a demonstration of global infrastructure. And that's why it caught my attention. Not because of the game, but because of what it reveals. It reveals how interconnected the world has become. Now, some people hear that and immediately become fearful. Others become overly optimistic. I'm not interested in either extreme. I'm interested in understanding, because the world is becoming more connected, and that seems obvious. The question is, connected towards what? Connected towards truth, confusion, wisdom, distraction, community, toward isolation, toward Christ, or away from Christ? Those are all questions that matter. Those are all questions fathers should be asking. Because the world our children inherit will almost certainly be more technological than the world we inherited. That's not speculation, that's just reality. The question is whether we are preparing them to navigate it wisely. That brings us back to something I've been wrestling with lately, and that's legacy. Because eventually, every generation hands the future to the next generation, whether we're ready or not. You have to think about that. My grandparents handed a world to my parents. My parents handed a world to me. And one day, I will hand a world to my daughters. The question isn't whether that transfer happens. The question is, what am I handing over? Wisdom, confusion, faith, distraction, truth, comfort, character, dependency. What exactly are we passing down? And brothers and sisters, I don't think that question only applies to families. I think it applies to nations, churches, communities, fellowships, channels. It applies to all of us. Because whether we realize it or not, we are constantly building the future, one decision at a time, one habit at a time, one example at a time, one generation at a time. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Because if systems reveal how civilization functions, then symbols reveal how civilization thinks. And when we start looking at symbols, ceremonies, traditions, and rituals, we begin seeing another layer behind the spectacle, a layer that every civilization throughout history has relied upon, the layer of meaning itself. So this is where the conversation usually gets interesting, because the moment you start talking about symbols, people tend to split into two camps. One camp says it's just symbolism, and the other camp says, well, everything is symbolism. As usual, I think reality lives somewhere in the middle, because symbols matter. But not every symbol is hiding a secret message. Not every ceremony is an occult ritual. Not every pattern is a conspiracy. And yet, human beings have always communicated through symbols. Always. Think about it. Before most people could read, they understood symbols. Kings used symbols. Armies used symbols. Religions use symbols. Families use symbols. Nations use symbols. People have always used images, colors, architecture, stories, songs, and ceremonies to communicate meaning. Why? Because symbols bypass long explanations. A symbol can communicate an entire story in a single image. So let me ask you something. Why do nations have flags? Seriously, think about it. A flag is just cloth. People will fight for it, die for it. They'll celebrate under it, they'll cry when they see it. But why? It's because it represents something larger than itself. The cloth isn't the point, the meaning is the point. And once you understand that, you begin seeing symbols everywhere. Wedding rings, crosses, uniforms, military medals, family heirlooms, graduation ceremonies, funerals, birthdays, national holidays. Every culture creates symbolic actions because human beings are storytelling creatures. We live inside stories, and stories require symbols. Now, here's where the world becomes fascinating because it is absolutely overflowing with symbolism. Flags, colors, national anthems, mascots, opening ceremonies, trophies, jerseys, songs, chants, visual image, entire nations telling stories about themselves. And honestly, that's not unusual. Every civilization does this. Ancient civilizations did it, modern civilizations do it, families do it, churches do it, even fellowships do it. Think about our own fellowship. We talk about watchmen, watchtowers, keeping the watchtower lit, and those are all symbols. And they communicate something. They communicate vigilance, faithfulness, preparedness, discernment, community. The symbol points toward a deeper truth. Now, here's where watchmen need to be careful, because symbolism can become obsession if we're not careful. Some people spend so much time looking for hidden meanings that they can't stop seeing obvious meanings. That's dangerous too. So let me give you a simple rule. When you encounter symbolism, observe first, research second, interpret third, and test fourth. The conclusion is last. Most people reverse the process. They conclude first, and they try to force everything else into their conclusion. That's not discernment. It's confirmation bias. A watchman should be better than that. So let's talk about ceremonies. Because ceremonies are another thing modern people often misunderstand. Many people act like ceremonies are outdated, ancient, unnecessary, but the truth is, we still love ceremonies. We just call them different things. Graduation ceremonies, award ceremonies, sporting ceremonies, military ceremonies, weddings, funerals, birthday traditions, holiday traditions. Human beings naturally create rituals. Now, I know the word ritual makes some people uncomfortable, but let's define it properly. A ritual is simply a repeated action filled with meaning. That's it. A family prayer before dinner is a ritual. Reading bedtime stories is a ritual. Celebrating Christmas traditions is a ritual. Attending church every Sunday is a ritual. The question isn't whether rituals exist. The question is, what are they teaching? Because rituals shape people. Repeated actions shape people. Habits shape people. Traditions shape people. And that's something fathers understand, at least eventually. When children are young, we often underestimate how much those little repeated moments matter. The nightly prayer, the family meal, the weekend routine, the annual traditions, the conversations in the car, the little simple things. But years later, those are often the things children remember. Not because they were spectacular, but because they were consistent. Brothers and sisters, consistency is one of the most underrated forces in human life. Let's think about it. Everybody wants dramatic transformation, but the most transformation happens through repetition, not one giant decision, but thousands of small decisions made every day. Not one grand speech, but thousands of ordinary conversations that we have every day. It's not one heroic act, but thousands of faithful actions. So let me connect this to something that I've been thinking about all week, and that's legacy. Because legacy is really just accumulated repetition. So let's think about it. A person's legacy isn't built in a day. It's built in habits, patterns, choices, years, decades. A father doesn't become a father through one moment. A grandfather doesn't become a grandfather through one moment. A watchman doesn't become a watchman through one moment. It all happens gradually, quietly, patiently, and that's actually encouraging because it means nobody has become perfect overnight. You have to keep moving in the correct direction. So let's shift slightly. Because if symbols reveal meaning and ceremonies reinforce meaning, then we need to talk about stories. The stories civilizations tell themselves, the stories nations tell themselves, the stories families tell themselves, the stories individuals tell themselves. Because stories are powerful. In fact, I would argue that stories shape civilization more than most people realize. Let's think about it. Every nation has founding stories. Every family has stories. Every church has stories. Every community has stories. And those stories help people answer questions like, who are we? Where did we come from? What do we believe? What matters? What are we trying to accomplish? Now, here's a difficult question. What stories are we telling our children? Now, what stories do we claim to believe? What stories are we actually telling? Are we telling them life is meaningless, nothing matters, everyone is selfish, truth doesn't exist? Or are we telling them truth matters, faith matters, character matters, service matters, family matters, and God matters? Because eventually those stories become identity, and identity becomes behavior, and behavior becomes destiny. So here's something fascinating about the World Cup. Billions of people are watching a story unfold, not just a game, but a story. We have underdogs, championships, victories, defeats, national pride, redemption arcs, heroes, villains, comebacks. The entire event is built around one narrative, because human beings don't just consume information, we consume stories. And maybe that's one reason Scripture is filled with stories. Not because God couldn't communicate through bullet points, but because stories reach places facts alone often cannot. So here's a question. What story are we living? What story are we handing to the next generation? And perhaps even more importantly, who is writing that story? Because, brothers and sisters, whether we realize it or not, something is always telling us who we are. Culture is trying, media is trying, politics are trying, algorithms are trying, advertising is trying. The world is constantly offering identity, constantly offering meaning, constantly offering belonging. And the watchman's responsibility is not to reject everything. The watchman's responsibility is to test everything, to ask, is this true? Is this good? Is this leading towards Christ or away from him? Because symbols matter, stories matter, ceremonies matter, identities matter, but truth matters most. And once we begin talking about truth, stories, and identity, we eventually arrive at something even more powerful. The way groups of people influence one another, the way emotions spread, the way crowds think, the way entire populations can move together. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating subjects in human behavior, and that is the psychology of crowds. So let's talk about crowds. Because crowds are strange. They're not bad or evil, but they're just strange. A crowd is one of the most fascinating things you'll ever observe. Take 1,000 people, put them in separate rooms, and they'll often behave in a similar way. Put those same 1,000 people together, and suddenly something changes. Emotions spread, energy spreads, excitement spreads, fear spreads, anger spreads, joy spreads, hope spreads, panic spreads. Human beings affect one another far more than most of us realize. And honestly, that's not even controversial. You experience it, I've experienced it, we've all experienced it. You walk into a room where everybody's laughing and you immediately feel different. You walk into a room where everybody is angry and you immediately feel different. You walk into a room where everybody is grieving and you immediately feel different. Human beings are constantly influencing one another. So let's take that principle and multiply it by 50,000 people in a stadium, or millions of people online, or billions of people paying attention to the same event. So now you start seeing why crowd psychology is such an important subject. Because crowds don't just reveal what people think, crowds reveal what people feel. Feelings are powerful. So before I go any further, let me say something that I think our culture desperately needs to hear. And that is feelings are not weakness. Now, they're not always accurate, they're not always wise, but they are not weakness. And I think that's something I have been learning lately. Because over the last few days, I found myself feeling things more deeply than usual. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. I've mentioned before that I go through these seasons, or reflective periods, these little dips, these moments where everything feels heavier. And for years, I used to fight that. I used to think something must be wrong, something must be broken. Why am I feeling this way? But lately, I've started looking at it different. What if sometimes emotions aren't evidence that something is wrong? What if sometimes emotions are evidence that you're finally paying attention? So let's think about that. What if some emotions exist to draw our attentions towards things that we have been ignoring? Responsibility, family, legacy, morality, purpose, faith, relationships, the passage of time. Maybe some of those emotions aren't enemies. Maybe they're messengers. Now, I'm not saying every emotion should be trusted. Absolutely not. Some emotions lie. Some emotions exaggerate. Some emotions distort reality. But some emotions reveal reality. Discernment is learning the difference. And that's where the watchman comes in. Because a watchman cannot afford to be ruled by emotion. But a watchman also cannot afford to ignore emotion. A watchman observes, tests, evaluates, and responds. Think about a guard dog standing on the wall. If he sees danger and feels nothing, that's a problem. If he panics every time he sees a shadow, that's also a problem. Wisdom lies between those extremes. So let's bring this back to the crowd. Because one thing that fascinates me about crowds is how quickly emotions become contagious. One person starts cheering, and then 10 join in, then 100, then 1,000, then the entire stadium. The same thing happens with fear. The same thing happens with anger, outrage, or with hope. Hope spreads too. Brothers and sisters, that realization hit me hard this week, because when I was reading through the fellowship report, I realized something. Hope had spread. Not because I was feeling hopeful, but because other people were. So let's think about that. I was sitting there, worried about whether I was letting people down. I was wondering if I was doing enough. I was wondering if the channel was moving fast enough. I was wondering if I was falling behind. And meanwhile, the fellowship was telling me, we're not leaving. Slow down, get some rest. We're still here. And hope spread. Not from me, but to me. And honestly, that humbled me. Because sometimes we imagine leadership means carrying everybody else. But real fellowship works both directions. Sometimes the shepherd encourages the flock. Sometimes the flock encourages the shepherd. And that's not weakness, that's family. That's community, that's fellowship. And maybe that's one reason the comments affected me more than usual. Because they reminded me that this isn't just content anymore. This is people, real people with real lives, real struggles, real prayers, real hopes, real disappointments, real victories, real faith. And suddenly the numbers stop mattering at all. Because numbers don't pray for you. People pray for you. Numbers don't encourage you. People do. Numbers don't build a fellowship. It does. So let me ask you something. When was the last time that you really paid attention to the people around you? Not their opinions, not their politics, not their social media profiles, but the actual people. Their fears, their burdens, their struggles, their hopes. Because one thing I've realized as I've gotten older is that almost everybody is carrying something. Can't always see it, but the person smiling might be hurting. The person succeeding might be exhausted. The person laughing might be grieving. The person who looks strong might feel overwhelmed. That's one reason grace matters, because we rarely know the full story. Now, here's something else I've been thinking about. When I was younger, I thought maturity meant becoming emotionally tougher. Now, I think maturity has to do more with becoming emotionally steadier. And there's a difference. Toughness often means building walls. Steadiness means building foundations. A foundation doesn't have to deny the storm. It simply remains standing during it. And brothers and sisters, I think that's what fathers are supposed to become. Not emotionless or unbreakable, but steady. The kind of people others can lean on when things get difficult. The kind of people who can stay calm when everyone else is panicking. The kind of people who can remain hopeful when everyone else is discouraged. The kind of people who can say, we'll get through this, even when they aren't entirely sure how. So let me be honest, I don't always get that right. Nobody does. There have been times in my life where I reacted badly. Times where I handled things poorly. Fear got the better of me. Frustration got the better of me. Pride got the better of me. But one thing I've learned is that failure doesn't have to be final. It's another lesson that age teaches. When you're young, mistakes feel permanent. When you're older, you realize mistakes are often teachers. Painful teachers, expensive teachers, but teachers nonetheless. And that realization changes how you see yourself. It changes how you see others, changes how you see your parents. But eventually you realize the people who raised you were learning too. The people who disappointed you were learning too. The people who hurt you were often carrying wounds of their own. So that doesn't excuse everything, but it does create room for understanding. Brothers and sisters, understanding creates space for healing. So let's bring this back to the World Cup one more time. Because when you watch a crowd in a stadium, you're watching humanity. Hope, fear, identity, joy, belonging, community, meaning, all mixed together. And that's why the event interests me. Not because of the score, but because it reveals human nature. It reveals what we're hungry for. It reveals what we're seeking. And ultimately, I think that's what humanity is seeking, and the same thing it's always been seeking. That's a place to belong, a reason to hope, a story that matters, a future worth building. And that brings me to the next question. If humanity is constantly searching for meaning, and if families are constantly passing things to the next generation, if nations are constantly shaping culture, then what exactly are we handing to the people coming after us? Because sooner or later, every generation must answer a difficult question. What kind of world are we building? That's the question underneath this Father's Day episode. It's the question underneath the World Cup, the question underneath this fellowship report. It's the question underneath the conversations that we've been having. It's the question underneath their emotions, reflections, and that is, what kind of world are we building? What kind of world are we living in? That's a different question. What kind of world are we building? Because whether we realize it or not, every single one of us is building something. Every day, every conversation, every decision, habit, example, every act of kindness, every act of selfishness, every moment of courage, every moment of fear, we're building something. And one day, someone else is going to inherit it. So let me tell you something that has been humbling me lately. The older I get, the more I realize that I am becoming one of the generations that I used to judge. So let's think about that. When you're younger, older people seem like a completely different species. You look at them and think, how could they not understand? How could they make those decisions? How could they miss that? And then one day you realize you're becoming one of them. Not because you're failing, but because time keeps moving. And suddenly you're the one carrying the responsibilities. You're the one making the decisions. You're the one trying to figure things out. You're the one the future generations will eventually evaluate. And brothers and sisters, that realization will humble you if you let it, because it forces you to acknowledge something. Maybe your parents weren't as clueless as you thought. Maybe your grandparents weren't as blind as you thought. Maybe they were simply navigating the world they inherited, just like we're navigating the world that we inherited. Now, don't misunderstand me. Every generation makes mistakes. Every generation leaves behind problems. Every generation has blind spots. Every generation gets some things right and some things wrong. But here's what I've been realizing. The people who came before us were not simply leaving behind problems. They were leaving behind gifts too. Roads, knowledge, stories, skills, lessons, faith, traditions, warnings, wisdom, and yes, sometimes wounds, sometimes bad habits, sometimes confusion, broken systems, but also gifts. And if we're going to be honest watchmen, we have to acknowledge both, because wisdom requires balance. So let's bring this into fatherhood, because Father's Day got me thinking about something. You know, when I was younger, I thought fathers' primary responsibility was providing, pay the bills, keep food on the table, keep the lights on, protect the family. And don't get me wrong, oh, those things matter. They matter a lot. But I think fatherhood is bigger than that, much bigger. Because fathers don't just provide resources, they provide direction, identity, examples, stories, habits, values, sometimes even without realizing it. Think about how many things you learned from your parents that were never formally taught. Nobody set you down and gave you a lecture. You simply watched. You watched how they treated people, how they handled money, how they responded to stress, how they handled disappointment. You watched how they approached faith. And those observations became part of you. So now, here's where it gets personal. Because one day, my daughters are going to look back at me. And honestly, that thought terrifies me. It's not because I don't love them, it's because I do. It's not because I don't try, it's because I do. It terrifies me because I know they're going to see my mistakes. They're going to see where I got things wrong. They'll see the opportunities that I missed. You'll see the moments I wasn't at my best. And for a long time, that bothered me. But lately, I've started looking at it a little bit differently because I realized something. I see my parents' mistakes too, and yet I still love them. I see my grandparents' mistakes, and I still appreciate them. I see where they stumbled, but I also see where they succeeded. I see where they struggled, and maybe that's the point. Maybe legacy isn't about perfection. Maybe legacy is about direction. So let's think about that. Maybe the goal isn't to leave behind a flawless example. Maybe the goal is to leave behind evidence that you kept trying, you kept learning, you kept growing, you kept turning toward truth, you kept turning toward God. Because if that's the standard, then suddenly hope becomes possible. So let's talk about another word, and that's stewardship. Because stewardship is one of those words Christians hear all the time, but I think we often make it too small. Most people hear stewardship and immediately think money, budgets, finances, resources. And yes, money is part of stewardship. But stewardship is much bigger than that. Stewardship is managing something that ultimately belongs to God. Your time, attention, relationships, knowledge, influence, children, communities, fellowships, everything. Think about it. Every one of us has been entrusted with something. Maybe it's a family, a friendship, a ministry. Maybe it's a skill or a business. Maybe it's simply the ability to encourage other people. Whatever it is, we're stewarding it. One day, we're handing it to someone else. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. We're always passing something down. Always. The question isn't whether we're leaving a legacy. The question is what kind. Because every family passes something down. Every church passes something down. Every nation passes something down. Every generation passes something down. And if we don't intentionally choose what we're passing down, we'll pass things down accidentally. Fear, bitterness, confusion, division, distraction. Those things spread too. But so does wisdom. Faith, kindness, courage, discernment, hope. So let me ask you something. If your children inherited your habits, would you be comfortable with that? Not your words, but your habits. If they inherited your attention patterns, would you be comfortable with that? If they inherited your relationship with God, would you be comfortable with that? If they inherited your relationship with technology, would you be comfortable with that? Those are difficult questions. But these are Watchman questions. Because Watchmen aren't supposed to merely observe the world. We're also supposed to examine ourselves. Brothers and sisters, I think that's what this season has been teaching me. I spent a lot of years looking outward, studying systems, studying history, culture, deception, narratives. And yes, those things matter. Sometimes God brings us back to a simpler question. What are you building? Not what are they building, not what is the government building or what society is building, but what are you building? What are you teaching? What are you modeling? What are you leaving behind? And honestly, that's a much harder question because it requires personal responsibility. So it's connected to the fellowship. Because one thing that stood out to me this week was realizing this community is becoming part of my legacy. So let's think about it. Not the channel, but the people. The friendships, the encouragement, the prayers, the conversations, the lessons, the moments. All those things matter. Those things outlast views, algorithms, trends. Suddenly I realized something. Maybe success isn't what I thought it was. Maybe success isn't building the biggest audience. Maybe success isn't helping build something real, something honest. Maybe success is just being useful, something that points people towards Christ. That's the main goal. And if that's true, then the question becomes even more important, because eventually every generation hands the world to the next generation. So the question is, what exactly are we handing them? And perhaps more importantly, are we leaving them reasons to hope? Because that's where this entire conversation is headed, and that's towards hope. not towards blind optimism or denial, but real hope, the kind that remains even after disappointment, even after mistakes, failure, regret, the kind of hope that only exists when your foundation is stronger than your circumstances. And that's where we're going next. Because before we finish this journey, we need to talk about the Watchman Creed itself, what it means to remain faithful in a world that never stops changing. Because everything we've talked about tonight eventually leads us here. The nations, the World Cups, the crowds, the symbols, the ceremonies, the technology, the families, the fathers, the children, the generations, the fellowship, all of it eventually leads us back to a single question. What is the watchman supposed to do with all of this? Because let's be honest, the world can be overwhelming. Every day there's another headline, another crisis, another controversy, another prediction, another technology, another distraction, another reason to become discouraged. And if we're not careful, we could spend so much time studying the world that we forget why we're even studying it in the first place. So, brothers and sisters, one thing I've noticed over the years is that there are two common mistakes that people make. And the first mistake is ignorance. They ignore everything, they pay attention to nothing, they refuse to ask questions, they refuse to think deeply. They simply drift wherever the current takes them. That's dangerous. But there's another mistake too. And I think the watchmen are especially vulnerable to it. And the second mistake is becoming so focused on darkness that you lose sight of the light. That's dangerous too, because if every study ends in fear, if every investigation ends in despair, if every conversation ends in hopelessness, then something has gone wrong. Because Christ did not call us to fear, he called us to faithfulness. So let's talk about the creed. The Watchman Creed exists for a reason. It is not just words. It is a framework, a lens. It's a reminder. It reminds us that there are forces in this world constantly trying to reshape human identity, trying to rewrite history, trying to redefine family, trying to replace truth with convenience, trying to replace wisdom with distraction, trying to replace Christ with substitutes. And honestly, it's not even controversial anymore. Let's look around. Everything wants your attention. Everyone wants your loyalty. Everyone wants your identity. Everyone wants to tell you who you are. But the watchman remembers something important. Identity is not something culture gives you. Identity is not something God gives us. And that's why the creed matters. Because the creed reminds us the counterfeit kingdom is always offering alternatives. Alternative truths, alternative purposes, alternative identities, alternative hopes. But they're still alternatives. And alternatives eventually fail. So let's think about the World Cup again. Billions of people watching, millions celebrating, entire nations invested, and yet eventually it ends. The final whistle blows, the trophy is lifted, the crowds go home, the stadium lights go dark, and life moves on. So, don't misunderstand me. I'm not criticizing the event. I'm just pointing to a truth. Everything that's temporary eventually ends. Every trend ends. Every season ends. Every empire ends. Every dynasty ends. Every movement ends. Every headline ends. Everything temporary eventually reaches its conclusion. And that realization used to bother me. But now, I find it comforting. Because it reminds me not to build my life on temporary things. So here's something else I've been thinking a lot about lately. The older I get, the more I appreciate permanence. When I was younger, I was fascinated by novelty. The next thing, the next new thing, the next exciting thing, the next unexpected thing. Now, I'm more interested in things that last. Faith that lasts. Friendships that last. Families that last. Truth that lasts. Character that lasts. And maybe that's because age has a way of teaching you almost everything else eventually fades. So let's make this personal. Think about your own life. How many things once seemed incredibly important that barely matter now? Think about that. The arguments, trends, drama, worries, the fears. So many things that once felt enormous have disappeared. And yet, some things remain. The people you love, the lessons you learned, the faith you carried, the memories that shaped you, the moments that changed you, those remain. And I think that's one reason the fellowship report affected me so deeply, because it reminded me what actually matters. Not numbers, not people, not algorithms. People. Not statistics, but people. Brothers and sisters praying for one another, encouraging one another, helping carry burdens, keeping the Watchtower lit together. That's real, that's lasting, that's meaningful. And honestly, I think that's one of the most hopeful things I've seen in a long time. Because the world often tells us that community is dying, that people are becoming isolated, that nobody cares anymore. And yet, here we are, a group of people scattered across different states, different countries, different backgrounds, different experiences, gathered together, gathered together around a shared pursuit of truth. Not because we agree on every detail, not because we're perfect, but because we're trying. And brothers and sisters, I think that matters. So let's go back to something I said earlier. One day, my daughters are going to look back at me. One day, your children will look back at you. One day, future generations will look back at all of us, and they will see our mistakes. They will see our blind spots. They will see our flaws, just like we see the flaws of previous generations. But here's what I realized. The question isn't whether they'll see our imperfections. They will. The question is whether they'll also see our faithfulness. Will they see people who kept trying, people who kept learning, people who kept growing, people who kept turning toward truth, people who kept turning towards Christ? Because that's the legacy I want to live, not perfection or faithfulness. So, brothers and sisters, this brings us to the final moment of the episode, the most important moment, because after all the reflection, after all the questions, after all the concerns and observations, we arrive to a simple truth. There are still reasons for hope. Not because the world is perfect, not because governments are perfect, not because technology is perfect, not because families are perfect, not because churches are perfect, and certainly not because we're perfect. But there's hope because Christ remains unchanged. There's hope because truth still exists. There's hope because people can still change. There's hope because families can still heal. There's hope because communities can still grow. There's hope because fellowship can still form. There's hope because God is still working. And brothers and sisters, that's where we're going next. Because before we close tonight, I want to spend some time talking about something the world desperately needs more of. And that's reasons for hope. Not wishful thinking, not denial, not pretending that problems don't exist, but real hope. The kind that survives disappointment, the kind that survives failure, the kind that survives Father's Day when it doesn't go exactly how you expected, the kind that survives difficult seasons. So, brothers and sisters, that's where the temporary crown finally gives way to the eternal kingdom. We talked about a lot tonight. We talked about fathers, children, generations, the World Cup, nations, symbols, technology, identity, crowds, legacy. We've talked about the world we're building. And after all that, I want to finish with hope. Because if a watchman spends all of his time looking at problems, eventually he'll forget why he's even standing on the wall. The purpose of the watchman isn't fear. The purpose of the watchman is faithfulness. The purpose of the watchman isn't panic. The purpose of the watchman is preparation. The purpose of the watchman isn't despair, but it is discernment. The discernment requires us to see both dangers and blessings, both warnings and opportunities, both problems and promises. So tonight, I want to leave you with some reasons for hope. Real reasons, not slogans, not wishful thinking, but reasons. So, reason for hope number one,
is that people still seek truth. The world keeps telling us nobody cares about truth anymore, but I don't believe that. Because if nobody cared about truth, then this fellowship wouldn't exist. People are still asking questions. People are still searching. People are still studying. People are still investigating. People are still opening their Bibles. People are still wrestling with difficult ideas. People are still hungry, and hunger matters. Because hungry people keep searching, and seekers eventually find things. And that's a reason for hope. So, reason for hope number 2 is the fellowship is real. Brothers and sisters, this one became very personal for me this week. I spent a lot of time worrying about the channel. Then I looked at the comments and suddenly I realized it's not just content. We have become a fellowship. People are praying for one another, encouraging one another, welcoming newcomers, helping carry burdens, refusing to quit, refusing to leave. And in a world that often feels disconnected, that is beautiful. And that is hope. So, reason for hope number 3 is that fathers still matter. Now, I know fatherhood gets attacked from every direction these days. Some people act like fathers are optional. Some people act like fathers are irrelevant. Some people act like fatherhood doesn't matter, but I disagree very strongly. Fathers matter. Not because fathers are perfect, but because fathers are influential. Fathers don't have to be flawless to matter. He simply just has to be present. He has to keep trying, keep learning, keep growing, keep showing up. And brothers, if you're listening tonight, don't underestimate the impact of your presence. The world might always notice. Your children might not always understand, but presence matters more than you realize. So, reason for hope number 4 is that children are not lost causes. Sometimes people talk about younger generations as if they're doomed, and I don't believe that. Every generation has strengths and weaknesses. Every generation has opportunities and challenges. And every generation needs guidance. My daughters aren't my reason for fear. What are my reasons for hope? Because every child represents possibility. Every child represents potential, and every child represents a future not yet written. And that is hope. So, reason for hope number 5 is wisdom can come from mistakes. This one took me years to learn. For a long time, I thought mistakes only created regret. Now I realize they can also create wisdom. Painful wisdom, expensive wisdom, but wisdom nonetheless. So, let's think about how many lessons we've learned the hard way. Think about how many lessons our parents learned the hard way. Think about how many lessons our grandparents learned the hard way. Mistakes didn't have to become chains. Sometimes they became teachers. And that means failures don't have to define you. And that is hope. So, reason for hope number 6 is technology does not have to own us. The world is changing rapidly. Artificial intelligence, social media, digital systems, constant connectivity. Some people are terrified. Some people are blindly enthusiastic. I think both extremes miss the point. Technology is a tool, and tools can be used wisely. The answer isn't panic. The answer is stewardship, discernment, and wisdom. And teaching the next generation how to use tools instead of being used by them. That is hope. Reason number 7 is nations can still be prayed for. One thing I love about the World Cup is that it reminds us how many nations exist on this earth. Different languages, different cultures, different histories, different struggles. And brothers and sisters, every one of those nations contains people. People loved by God. People who need truth. People who need hope. People who need Christ. The gathering of nations should remind us to pray. Not just analyze, but pray. And prayer is always a reason for hope. So, reason for hope number 8 is God still works in small places. The world loves big numbers, big platforms, big audiences, big headlines, big movements. But Scripture is full of God working through small things. A shepherd boy, a handful of disciples, a mustard seed, a widow's offering, a small fellowship gathered around truth. Never underestimate what God can do with something small. That is hope. Reason for hope number 9, rest is not failure. This lesson is mostly for me, but maybe it's for some of you too. Sometimes we treat rest like weakness. We treat slowing down like failure. We treat reflection like defeat. But maybe that's not true. Maybe some seasons are for building, and some seasons are for evaluating. Maybe some seasons are for action, and some seasons are for reflection. The watchman who never rests eventually stops seeing clearly. Brothers and sisters, I think that's one reason this fellowship kept telling me to slow down, rest, and we'll still be here, and that is hope. And the final reason for hope, number 10, is obvious, and that is Christ is still King. And it's the final reason and the greatest reason. Everything else changes. Nations change, technologies change, families change, generations change, cultures change. The World Cup ends, the trophy is lifted, the crowd goes home, the lights go out, the temporary crown fades, but Christ remains, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Brothers and sisters, if your hope is in the world, you'll eventually be disappointed. If your hope is in politics, you will eventually be disappointed. If your hope is in technology, you will eventually be disappointed. If your hope is in people, you will eventually be disappointed. But if your hope is in Christ, you have found something that does not fade, something that does not rust, something that does not expire, something that does not go out of style, but something eternal. And that's why we can remain hopeful. So, the title of this episode has been sitting with me all week, The Temporary Crown. Think about that image. The champion wins, the trophy is lifted, the crowd erupts, the confetti falls, the celebration begins, and it's wonderful. But eventually, the crowd leaves, the cameras shut off, the confetti is cleaned up, the stadium empties, and life moves forward. Every earthly crown is temporary. Every record is eventually broken. Every champion is eventually replaced. Every empire eventually falls. Every generation eventually passes. Even we will eventually pass, and that is reality. But that isn't the end of the story, because while early crowns fade, faith remains. Truth remains, love remains, character remains, legacy remains, and Christ remains. And that's the difference. The world offers crowns. Christ offers a kingdom. The world offers recognition. Christ offers redemption. The world offers applause, and Christ offers purpose. The world offers moments, but Christ offers eternity. So before we close, I want to speak directly to a few groups. To the fathers, keep showing up, keep learning, keep apologizing when necessary, keep teaching, keep praying, keep loving. Your work matters more than you realize. To the mothers, thank you. Thank you for the sacrifices nobody sees, for the prayers nobody hears, for the strength nobody notices until it's needed. To the grandparents, your stories matter. Your wisdom matters. Your examples matter. Don't stop sharing them. To the children listening, give your parents grace. One day, you'll realize they were learning too. To those who had a difficult Father's Day, you're not alone. To those who miss their fathers, you're not forgotten. To those who never had the father they needed, God sees you. To those trying to become better than the generation before them, keep going. And to the fellowship, thank you. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your encouragement. Thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for helping keep the Watchtower lit. So let's pray. Father, thank you for this fellowship. Thank you for every brother, sister, watchman, father, mother, grandparent, and child listening. Thank you for the prayers that have been offered. Thank you for the encouragement that has been shared. Thank you for the ways you continue working even when we can't see it. Lord, strengthen the fathers, comfort those who feel unseen, heal families carrying old wounds, give wisdom to parents raising children in a complicated world, give discernment to watchmen, give courage to those who are discouraged, give rest to those who are weary, give provision where provision is needed, give direction where direction is needed, protect this fellowship, protect the families represented here, bless Rachel and everyone searching for genuine fellowship. Bless the nations of this world. Help us remain faithful. Help us remain hopeful. Help us remain hopeful. And above all, help us keep our eyes fixed on Christ. In Jesus' name, amen. So brothers and sisters, thank you for spending this time with me this morning. Thank you for helping keep the Watchtower lit. Remember, the temporary crown fades, but the eternal kingdom remains. This has been Truth-Seeking Foogler. Discern the signs, seek the truth, and walk in the light.